The low hum of polite conversation was a thin veneer over the tension coiling in the private dining room of Solis. Quan Jinwu sat at the head of the lacquered mahogany table, a king on a temporary throne. The crystal glasses reflected the city lights like captured stars, and the air was thick with the scent of money, power, and seared wagyu. Opposite him sat Mr. Park and Mr. Choi, vultures in tailored suits, their smiles as sharp and predatory as their intentions. They were allies of convenience, their loyalty as fluid as the vintage Bordeaux they swirled in their glasses. Jinwu despised them, but business was business, and the unification of the Seoul underworld required unpleasantries. Tonight was one such unpleasantry, and he had brought a curiosity with him, a disruption to their delicate ecosystem of sharp angles and sharper blades. In the corner, slightly behind him, sat his secretary, Amara. She was a stark contrast to the room's lethal elegance. She was soft where they were hard, her form generous and rounded in a simple, almost apologetic beige dress that did little to flatter and everything to camouflage. Her presence was an insult, and Jinwoo knew it. He had brought her for that very reason. A test. A message. He could bring anyone, even this quiet, unassuming foreign woman, into their world, and they would do nothing. He had hired her 6 months ago, drawn to her quiet efficiency and her utter invisibility. She managed his legitimate schedules with a placid competence that bored him, yet he kept her on. There was something in her stillness he couldn't quite decipher, a depth he occasionally glimpsed in her dark, watchful eyes before she would look away, her demeanor once again subservient. Tonight, she was a pawn, a fleshy, breathing symbol of his untouchable authority. "The port acquisitions are proceeding," Jinwoo stated, his voice a low baritone that cut through the clinking of cutlery. "The union officials have been persuaded." Mr. Park offered a slick, reptilian smile. "Your methods are always so effective, Mr. Kwan."
Direct.
Unambiguous. The compliment was laced with poison, a subtle jab at Jinwoo's reputation for brutality. Choi, ever the sycophant, chimed in. "Indeed." A masterclass in negotiation, his eyes flickered towards Amara, a dismissive, almost contemptuous glance. "You even bring your own note-taker to ensure no detail is missed." Very thorough, Jinwoo's jaw tightened imperceptibly. He followed Choi's gaze. Amara sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, a small digital tablet beside her untouched. She looked like a lost lamb in a den of wolves, her soft features and the plainness of her attire making her seem utterly out of place. He had expected her to be nervous, to fidget under the weight of their scrutiny. But she was calm. Her breathing was even, her posture relaxed but not slumped. It was the unnerving stillness he'd noticed in his office, magnified now in this pressure cooker of a room. He had assumed it was timidity, a sign of being overwhelmed. Now, watching her under the hostile gaze of his rivals, he wasn't so sure. It looked less like fear and more like patience, an unsettling thought. He dismissed it as a trick of the light, a projection of his own paranoia. She was just a secretary.
A tool.
Nothing more. The strategic placement of a piece on the board designed to unsettle his opponents through its sheer inappropriateness. That was all she was, and all she needed to be for his purposes tonight. Her purpose was to be weak, a foil to his strength. The conversation continued, a verbal dance of veiled threats and strategic posturing. They discussed territories, shipments, and the unfortunate disappearances of mutual inconveniences. Through it all, Jinwoo was acutely aware of Amara. He had intended for her to be a background element, a piece of set dressing, but her presence was becoming a distraction. He watched as a waiter approached to refill her water glass. She gave the man a small, polite nod, her eyes briefly meeting his. There was no subservience in the gesture, just a simple, human acknowledgement. The waiter, a man trained to be invisible, actually faltered for a second, a flicker of surprise on his face before he recovered and moved on. Jinwoo saw it. It was nothing, a meaningless micro-interaction, yet it pricked at his consciousness. People didn't see Amara. That was her primary quality. She was designed by nature and choice to be overlooked. Yet that waiter had seen her. Choi, growing bolder with the wine, leaned forward. "A sentimental choice, Mr. Kwan? Bringing your pet to a business dinner?" The insult was overt now, The pretense of civility shed. Jinwoo placed his chopsticks down with deliberate precision, the soft click echoing in the sudden silence. She is my employee, Mr. Choi. And she is here because I wish her to be. Are my wishes a problem for you? The threat was unmistakable. Choi paled slightly, raising his hands in a gesture of mock surrender. Of course not. I merely comment on your eclectic tastes. Before Jinwoo could deliver a more cutting retort, the world outside their private sanctuary dissolved into chaos. A sudden, concussive blast blew the ornate doors off their hinges, followed by the terrifyingly sharp report of gunfire and the shattering of glass. The transition from Cold War to Hot War was instantaneous. Shouts erupted from the main dining hall. Screams. The heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. Jinwoo's two bodyguards, positioned outside the now-destroyed doors, were already engaged, their own weapons returning fire with disciplined bursts. Jinwoo reacted on pure instinct, kicking his chair back and drawing the sleek, custom pistol from the holster beneath his jacket. Park and Choi scrambled for cover under the table like the rats they were, their bravado vanishing in a puff of terror. Amara. Down, he yelled, his voice a guttural command. He expected her to be frozen in fear, a useless civilian liability he'd have to protect or abandon. He spared a half-second glance in her direction and saw her on the floor, but she wasn't cowering. She had moved with a strange, fluid grace, not dropping in a panic but lowering herself with control, her back against the wall, her eyes scanning the doorway. Not with terror, but with assessment. Another anomaly. He had no time to process it. 3 figures clad in black tactical gear stormed the room, stepping over the bodies of his fallen guards. They were professionals. Their movements were fluid, their aim steady. They weren't the usual street thugs. This was a coordinated, high-level hit. The first attacker raised his rifle, aiming directly at Jinwoo. Time seemed to slow. Jinwoo leveled his own pistol, but the attacker had the drop on him. He was a fraction of a second too late. He braced for the impact, the searing pain. A curse formed on his lips. He had made a mistake. Bringing her here, this display of arrogance had created a vulnerability they had exploited. But the shot never came. From the corner of his eye, he saw a blur of beige. Amara. She moved with a speed that defied her size, a shocking explosion of kinetic energy. She wasn't clumsy or brutish. She was a force of nature. In one fluid motion, she had launched herself from her position against the wall, snatching a heavy silver serving platter from a nearby cart. The first attacker, his finger tightening on the trigger, didn't even have time to register her as a threat. She slammed the edge of the platter into the side of his neck with a sickening crunch of cartilage and bone. The man dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his throat as he collapsed, gurgling. She didn't pause to admire her work. She used the momentum of her first strike to pivot, the platter now a shield as the second attacker opened fire. The bullets ricocheted off the silver with deafening pings. She closed the distance in 2 long strides. Her free hand shot out, grabbing the barrel of his weapon and wrenching it upwards. At the same time, her body slammed into his, using her full weight not as a clumsy cudgel, but as a precisely aimed battering ram, driving him backward off his feet. He crashed into the mahogany table, the wood groaning under the impact. Before he could recover, she brought the platter down on his face with a final, definitive crack. It was over in less than 5 seconds. 2 professional assassins, neutralized by his secretary. With a serving platter, the room plunged into a deafening, ringing silence. The third attacker, who had been focused on the cowering forms of Park and Choi, froze mid-stride. His weapon was half-raised, his masked face turned toward the source of the sudden, brutal violence. Jinwoo himself was frozen, his pistol still aimed at the spot where the first attacker had stood. His mind struggled to reconcile the image of the quiet, soft-spoken woman who alphabetized his files with the lethal predator standing over 2 broken men. Park and Choi stared out from under the table, their eyes wide with disbelief and raw terror. The entire scene was suspended in a moment of collective shock. Amara stood in the center of the room, breathing calmly. The beige dress was slightly askew, but otherwise, she was untouched. The silver platter, now dented and stained, was held loosely in one hand. Her face, usually a mask of placid neutrality, was utterly transformed. Her eyes, which he had once thought of as merely observant, were now cold, hard, and ancient. They held the chilling calm of a hunter that has just made a kill. There was no panic, no adrenaline-fueled tremor. There was only focus, a deadly, absolute certainty that radiated from her, changing the very atmosphere of the room. She was no longer a pawn. She was the most dangerous piece on the board. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the gurgling breaths of the first attacker and the distant sounds of the ongoing firefight in the main hall. Jinwoo lowered his gun, not out of a sense of safety, but out of a profound, instinctual understanding that the power dynamic in the room had just been irrevocably rewritten. He was no longer the apex predator here. Amara's gaze swept over the scene, her assessment of the room taking less than a second. Her eyes met Jinwoo's for a fleeting moment, and in that look, he saw nothing of the woman he thought he knew. There was no deference, no fear. There was an unnerving flicker of something that looked like disappointment, as if she were chiding him for his carelessness. Then she turned her attention to the third, still frozen attacker. Kangpai from the Viper clan, she said. Her voice was different. The soft, slightly hesitant tone she used in the office was gone, replaced by a low, resonant clarity that commanded attention. It was a voice accustomed to giving orders, not taking them. Amateur. They came in too loud, too fast. A show of force, not a clean extraction. She spoke in perfect, unaccented Korean, a fluency he had never suspected. The third attacker finally broke from his stupor, letting out a guttural yell as he charged at her, firing wildly. His shots went wide, punching holes in the silk-paneled walls. Amara didn't flinch. She dropped the platter and moved toward him, not away. It was a suicidal, nonsensical move, but she flowed around his clumsy assault like water around a stone. She sidestepped his first shot, her hand darting out to slap the barrel of his rifle aside as he fired again. The bullet tore through the back of a chair. She used his forward momentum against him, hooking her foot behind his ankle while her palm struck the side of his knee. His leg buckled, and he went down with a cry of pain and surprise. The rifle clattered to the floor. She scooped it up in one smooth, practiced motion, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and rendered the weapon useless in a single, efficient sequence that spoke of years of training. The fight wasn't over. From the ruined doorway, two more Vipers appeared, drawn by the sounds of the struggle. They saw their fallen comrades, the useless rifle in Amara's hands, and the stunned Mafia boss. They raised their weapons. Jinwoo started to raise his own pistol again, but Amara was already in motion. She threw the empty rifle at the closest man, a heavy, spinning projectile that caught him square in the chest, knocking him off balance. She didn't wait to see the result. She was already moving toward the wreckage of the dining cart. Her hand closed around the long, sharp carving knife used for the prime rib. The second man fired, but she was a moving target, using the overturned table as cover. The bullets splintered the heavy wood, sending shards flying. She vaulted over the table, a surprising, explosive display of agility. She landed in a low crouch, the carving knife held in a reverse grip. The man from the doorway fumbled to correct his aim. He was too slow. She lunged forward, a blur of beige fabric and gleaming steel. There was no wasted movement. The knife flashed once, a swift, deadly arc across his throat. He dropped his weapon, his hands clutching at the gushing wound as he crumpled to the floor. The first man, having recovered from the impact of the thrown rifle, raised his own weapon. But Amara was already spinning, grabbing a wine bottle from the table. With a flick of her wrist, she smashed it against the table's edge, creating a jagged glass weapon. She didn't hesitate. She drove the broken bottle into the man's exposed side, twisting it with a vicious finality. He screamed, a raw, agonized sound that was cut short as he collapsed. The room fell silent once more. 5 trained assassins, taken down in minutes by one woman. Amara stood amidst the carnage, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Splatters of blood marred the sleeve of her beige dress, a stark crimson against the neutral fabric. The carving knife was still in her hand, held with a familiarity that chilled Jinwoo to the bone. She was a masterpiece of violence, a perfect, deadly machine hidden beneath a disarming shell of soft curves and quiet deference. He stared at her, a maelstrom of emotions swirling within him: shock, fury at his own ignorance, and a dark, terrifying current of awe. This creature of brutal efficiency had been sitting outside his office for 6 months, fetching his coffee, scheduling his meetings, and observing him with those placid, unreadable eyes. Park and Choi were still huddled under the table, trembling. They weren't looking at the dead men. They were looking at Amara, their faces masks of pure, primal fear. In their world, power was everything, and they had just witnessed a display of power so absolute, so unexpected, that it had shattered their understanding of the hierarchy. Amara finally let the knife clatter to the floor. She straightened her dress, a strangely mundane gesture in the midst of such devastation. Then, she turned and walked slowly toward Jinwoo. Her steps were deliberate, measured. The illusion was gone. There was no more secretary. There was only the predator. She truly was. She stopped a few feet from him, her gaze locking with his. The question burned in his throat, the only one that mattered. "What are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She tilted her head, a small, almost curious gesture. "A contingency," she replied, her voice calm and even. "Your contingency." They drove back to his penthouse in suffocating silence. The city lights smeared past the armored windows of the sedan, but Jinwoo saw none of it. His entire focus was on the woman sitting beside him. The beige dress was gone, discarded at the restaurant, and replaced by a simple black coat one of his cleanup crew had provided. In the dim light of the car, she seemed to blend into the shadows, yet her presence was more potent than ever. He could still see the flash of the knife, still hear the sickening crunch of bone. The image was burned into his memory. He had built an empire on control, on knowing every variable, on anticipating every threat. Amara was a variable he hadn't even known existed. She was not a person. She was a living, breathing black swan event that had just detonated in the middle of his life. He had prided himself on his ability to read people, to see the ambition, the greed, the fear behind their eyes. When he looked at her, he had seen nothing. He realized now that it wasn't because there was nothing there, but because she was a master of concealment. A ghost who had walked into his life and made him believe she was solid. "Who sent you?" he finally asked, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. He needed a name, an organization. The ghost sector of the NIS? A private security firm from his father's old guard? "No one sent me," she said, her voice still holding that new, unnerving authority. She was looking out the window, watching the city as if it were a map of her own design. "I chose the position. This was worse." An unknown entity placing an asset this valuable inside his operation was one thing. A self-directed agent of chaos choosing him as her cover was another entirely. It was more personal, more dangerous. "Why?" he demanded, the frustration and rage finally bubbling to the surface. "Why my company? Why me?" She turned her head slowly, her eyes meeting his in the dark. "Because you were powerful enough to be a shield, but arrogant enough not to look too closely at the person polishing it." The statement was a physical blow, a perfect strike against his ego. She had seen his greatest strength, his unshakable confidence, and identified it as his greatest weakness. She had used his own arrogance as her camouflage. The thought was both infuriating and intoxicating. He had never met anyone who could see him so clearly, let alone use that clarity against him. The woman he had considered a simple, perhaps even pitiable, employee had in fact been studying him, judging him, and finding him wanting. The car pulled into the secure underground garage of his building. The engine cut off, plunging them into a deeper silence. He didn't move. He just watched her. The romantic tension that had been a faint, dismissive spark in his mind before had now ignited into a dangerous inferno. It was a primal attraction, born of violence and power. He saw not a secretary, but an equal, a queen, a weapon he desperately wanted to possess, even as he knew she could never be truly controlled. "You put my entire operation at risk tonight," he said, his voice low and dangerous, a desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of dominance. "Your little performance. My performance saved your life," she cut in, her tone sharp, devoid of any deference. "Your arrogance put us in that room. Your predictability made you a target. I simply cleaned up your mess. He should have been furious. He should have dragged her from the car and demanded answers until she broke. But he knew she wouldn't break. The woman who could neutralize 5 armed assassins with tableware did not break. Instead, he felt a chilling thrill. For the first time in a decade, someone was challenging him without fear. He was looking at the rarest creature in his world, someone who wasn't afraid of him. And she worked for him, or at least she had. "You're fired," he said, testing the words, testing her. Amara simply smiled, a slow, knowing curve of her lips that was more terrifying than any threat. "No, I'm not," she said softly. "Your enemies now know you have a new kind of weapon. My enemies now know where I am. We are tied together, Mr. Kwon, whether you like it or not. From now on, I'm not your secretary. I'm your partner." The word hung in the air between them, a promise and a threat. His world had been upended, his control shattered. And in its place was a new, terrifying, and exhilarating reality. He was no longer a king on a throne. He was one of 2 predators circling each other in the same cage. And the game had just begun. Thank you so much for watching until the end. That reveal was insane, right? I was on the edge of my seat. What do you think Amara's backstory is? Was she a government agent, a rogue assassin, or something else entirely? Let me know your theories down in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to see what happens next in the volatile partnership between Jinwoo and Amara, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next part of their intense story. We have so much more planned, and you won't want to miss a single moment. Thanks again for your support, and we'll see you in the next video.